All right, welcome back, everybody. Today we're going to be talking about sailing with visual feedback, and this is part one of probably a three-part series. So we'll start off the basics, talk about the open loop case, or open loop sailing, as I call it. So I'll draw our very familiar points of sail diagram. And of course, we have wind coming down the page, we have irons, we have our first beat, our sails all the way in, our reach, sails halfway in, halfway out, our run, sails all the way out, back to our reach, and lastly our beat. So hopefully everybody is familiar with this by now. This is something you learn the first couple of days of sailing. Basically, what I mean by open loop sailing is you look at this diagram, you look at where the wind's coming from, you set your boat heading or the angle with which your boat is with respect to the wind direction, and then you set your sails accordingly, and then boom, you're done. So we all know that wind is dynamic and somewhat stochastic or random. If it wasn't, that would make sailboat racing really boring and static, and we all probably wouldn't be here learning about it. So thankfully, it is dynamic. So if we choose to open loop sail, it's basically suboptimal. So what we need to do is we need to use the sensors or information that we have around the boat and sails to close the loop, as I'm calling it, and adjust, trim our sails accordingly. So that brings me into closed loop sailing. So what sensors are available to us? Well, the primary ones that we're interested in today are the ones that can be found on racing, 420s, and FJs. The ones that we can find at the common clubs that we go to and travel to and race against. So those are, of course, one, Telltales, and two, streamers. And I'll show you what I mean by both of those in 1 minute, but I just want to let everybody know that these are often called by a lot of other names as well. And some people call streamers Telltales and Telltale streamers. I'll show you how I differentiate it. So we've got our 420 or FJ, got our sails. Now I call Telltales the Telltales or the pieces of ribbon or yarn that come off of the sails themselves. So on the jib, we have our starboard telltale and our port telltale. And typically on racing 420s and FJs, when you travel to other clubs, there's not often telltales on the mainsail. We'll talk about that in a little bit. And what I mean by streamers are the pieces of Dacron or yarn that come off of the shrouds. And that's how I differentiate them. And of course, when we look at the jib, we have a lower telltale. We also have an upper telltale. And like I said, sometimes they're on the mainsail as well, but we can't really count on that for college racing because it's so inconsistent. So what do Telltales tell us? I'll just label these Telltales streamers. So Telltales tell us a coarse snapshot of the flow field of air around our cells. They do not tell us wind direction. Now, what do streamers tell us? Streamers give us a metric or direction of our apparent wind. Not the true wind, right? Because as we're moving through air and the air is also moving through us, both of those vectors combined into what we see as our apparent wind as we move through air and air moves through us. So general uses of these sensors in racing. So for upwinds, and this is really for Telltales specifically, for upwinds, right, we sheet in our sails and then we use the Telltales Telltales to adjust our heading or our pointing vector relative to the wind direction as it changes. And then on offsets or reach marks, we set our heading. It's kind of the reverse. We set our heading and then we use our Telltales to adjust our sail trim. And we're constantly adjusting those both situations. So what happens if we don't have any Telltales on the mainsail? Well, we can use the jib, and its Telltales to trim the main. And so the idea here is to, trim the jib first based on the criteria, either for upwinds or offsets, reach marks first. And then we can trim our mainsail to create a slot, a parallel slot between the two sails, such that the flow in between and around these sails all remains attached, nice and smooth and nice and laminary. Let me just write that real quick, and then I'll draw some diagrams to tell you what I mean. So first we trim jib with Telltales, and then we slot the main. So I'll draw three cases. Case 1, case 2, case 3. Here we have a correctly trimmed jib in each case. In the first case, our mainsail is trimmed in too much. In the second case, our mainsail is let out too much. And in the last case, we have a nice slot. So what happens to the flows around these sails in incorrect cases? Well, in case 1, where we have our main trimmed in too much, And we have nice laminar flow on the outside of the jib, but inside we get an overexpansion onto the mainsail from the opening nozzle, if you want to think about that, between the mainsail and the jib. And what that does is it leads to inefficiencies due to the overexpansion and takes away from the lift that can be generated on our big mainsail. And that obviously takes away from our forward propulsion. This is the overexpanded case. And that's leads to a loss of energy transfer between the wind and boat. Now in the middle case, we have our choked flow. And so what happens here is we get some nice flow on the outside of the jib again. Maybe it bounces off. That's not our primary concern. Our primary concern is the flow inside here, where it hits, bounces off again, and then on the outside of the main, we get flow separation and worse pressure differential, which leads to detached flow, and then this negative pressure region where we can get some turbulence right here, filling back in. But it probably won't reach the sail such that we have this choked scenario. And like I said, that leads to detached flow. And in that case, there's no air to actually add pressure to the side of the sail and move it forward. We lose that. So both these first two cases are incorrect, and our natural intuition should say that, yes, we want them to be the same so that the flow around the sails are the same. Oops, wrong color. Nice and parallel. And that forms the perfect slot. We're getting the most energy possible. We're taking the most energy possible from the wind, converting it to usable thrust in this perfect slot case. So again, we trim the jib first with the Telltales, and then we slot the main to follow suit. And this is a pretty standard thing to look at and pretty intuitive. But I did want to just note that in dynamic situations like team racing and quick offset mark rounding, so after you round the windward mark or the weather mark and you offset, when you're adjusting sails simultaneously as your boat heading, it's pretty hard to do this well and in sync, such that you're actually maximizing the amount of thrust you get from both rotating your boat and trimming your sails at the same time. So it's not trivial when you actually put it into practice in these dynamic situations. All right, so we know how to use Telltales now, at least most basically. Now we're going to go over reading Telltales. How do we actually look at them and their behavior and adjust our sails? And this, in the most basic case, is just the windward versus our leeward Telltales. So we have our boat, we've got our wind. Right now, port side is windward and starboard is leeward. So I'll draw our two cases. Case one, we have our jib. And on our jib, the way it's trimmed right now, we've got nice flow on the inside. But on the outside, we have a luffing telltale. It's bouncing all over the place. And that is essentially just due to the same reason above, where we get a little bit of turbulence coming off the edge of the sail right here. And then we have this flow separation or detachment from the sail, which leads to this negative pressure gradient. So in this case, the leeward or the outside telltale flaps, which means that we can either head or point our boat up towards the wind. So we can change our boat heading, or we can keep our boat heading the same, and we can let our jib out until we get both telltales flying nice and straight. That's case one. Now case two of our jib. And now the inside telltale is flapping. And the outside telltale is nice and straight. Well, it's kind of the same case, just reversed from the other one. And so here we have our windward or inside telltale flapping. Now we should either point or head away from the wind, or we can pull our sail in until both telltales are flapping nice and straight. So our goal is to have both the inside and outside telltale nice and straight back, and that lets us know that the flow across our sail is attached, it's laminary, and it's generating or harvesting the most energy out of the wind as possible to convert it into forward momentum. And the case on the right, where we have the inside telltale, that's often called pinching, or if you're a laser sailor and you're doing it on purpose, we call it feathering sometimes. You want to get a little fancy about it, use some fun words. So telltales are also an immediate way of telling if you've encountered a header or lift, and specifically the windward versus leeward case. And these header or lifts are puffs of wind that basically deviate from the currently experienced direction, and they indicate either a local change in wind direction and pressure, or a more global change, which you would expect if you were expecting a steady secular drift in wind direction throughout the day. For example, if a sea breeze was generally coming in as the hours go on. So that kind of caps off the part one of sailing with feedback, visual feedback. In the next video, I'm going to talk about upper versus lower jib telltales, reading streamers, and then synthesizing all of that information to make the best adjustments possible on the water. Then I'll also talk about how we can adjust our jib leads on FJs, and if we don't have jib leads, how we can cross sheet our jib to also get better agreement between upper and lower jib telltales, because right now we've only focused on the windward leeward sides of things, but we also care about the top and bottom dimension of our jib and the flow across those and the differential between those as well. We also want